Welcome back to Through the Valley. This is your host, Bahar Alexander, executive coach, author, and speaker. So, what should we talk about today? That's a question I've heard Esther Perel use beautifully many times. And as I sat down to prepare for this episode, I found myself asking exactly that. What should we talk about? And that's not because there is a shortage of topics. Goodness knows there isn't. Leadership alone could keep us occupied for several lifetimes. But I didn't want to simply choose another topic. I wanted to sit down with some curiosity and ask, what would be the most organic next step in the journey we've been taking together? Because we've been creating something, we've been building something. In our first episode of this season, we explored communication. Not communication as a collection of techniques and frameworks, but communication as the bridge through which coherence becomes possible. Then we explored listening. And we discovered that perhaps listening isn't simply something we do with our ears. It is an act of perception. It is an act of presence. Perhaps even the first act of leadership. And as I sat thinking about those two conversations, I realized something. There is a condition underneath both of them. Something communication requires, something listening absolutely depends on, something our relationships need, our development, our dreams, our leadership needs. Actually, even our entire lives depend on it. What is that? Engagement. And I laughed a little when that word came to me because, good grief, if there is one thing human beings seem to be struggling with right now, it's being where we actually are. We have become extraordinarily talented at being everywhere except for here. We can be sitting in a meeting while answering an email, having a dinner while checking Instagram, watching TV while scrolling through our phones, listening to someone while preparing what we're going to say next, working while thinking about the weekend, and then spending the entire weekend thinking about work. It's quite impressive when you really think about it. We've created an entire civilization that allows us to be physically present while psychologically somewhere else entirely. And organizations are noticing that. Employee engagement has become one of the greatest conversations of our modern world. Organizations measure it, survey it, benchmark it. They create initiatives around it. Leaders consistently worry about it. Consultants write reports on it. And yet, I wonder whether we've made engagement too small. Because engagement isn't fundamentally an organizational issue. It is a human issue. Long before we become disengaged from our work, we can become disengaged from ourselves, from our relationships, from curiosity, from development, from our dreams, and sometimes even from our own lives. And that's what I want to explore with you today. Not how do we make employees more engaged and productive, but something much more fundamental. What allows a human being to fully participate in their own life, and what gets in the way of that? When we hear the word engagement, we often associate it with enthusiasm. As I said, productivity, motivation, energy, commitment. But I think engagement begins somewhere much deeper. For the purpose of our conversation today, I would like to offer you a different definition of engagement. Engagement is the availability of our attention, energy, and agency for meaningful participation. So engagement is the availability of our attention, our energy, and our agency for meaningful participation. Attention, energy, agency, and participation. Those words matter because you can be highly motivated and still not be engaged. You can care enormously about something and still find yourself unable to move toward it. You can love someone and not really be present with them. You can have a dream that matters everything to you and spend years avoiding the very actions that would move you toward it. You can be ambitious, successful, productive, and profoundly disengaged from your own experience of living. That's why I don't think engagement is simply enthusiasm. Engagement is availability. How much of you is actually available to meet the moments you're standing in? And suddenly engagement becomes intimately connected with everything we've been exploring in this podcast. Because if your attention is consumed, if your nervous system is protecting, if your internal architecture is filled with interferences, then part of your capacity is already occupied, which means it isn't available for participation. This brings us back to one of the governing principles I've shared throughout Through the Valley episodes. Integration determines capacity. And engagement is one of the places where the capacity becomes visible. Because if I have the capacity to show up in a certain way, but I'm unable to do it, that means that capacity is not integrated. There's a wonderful little book by the philosopher Alan Watts, one of my absolute favorites, called The Wisdom of Insecurity. I've just read it for the third time recently. It was published in 1951, long before smartphones, social media, long before Slack notifications, and long before your watch could actually interrupt you and tell you that your phone requires your attention. And yet the central problem was exploring feels remarkably contemporary. He was fascinated by our difficulty inhabiting the present moment, by the way human beings sacrifice the experience of now in an attempt to secure themselves against an uncertain future. We tell ourselves, when I get the promotion, when I earn enough, when the kids are old enough, when the business becomes successful, when I find that relationship, when things are calmed down, then I can live. Then I'll relax. Then I'll enjoy myself. Then I'll feel secure. But there is a rather inconvenient problem with that strategy. And here's the problem. Life doesn't happen later. Life keeps happening now. And I think our modern world has amplified this ancient human tendency enormously, because now we're dealing with two different sources of distraction. The one outside of us and the one inside of us. Let's begin with the external distraction, which is the obvious one. Your attention has become incredibly valuable. So much is vying for it. There are entire industries competing for it. Notifications, news, advertising, social media, email, entertainment, messages, algorithms. Everything wants a piece of you, piece of your attention. And individually, those interruptions can seem insignificant. Just checking something, we say. Just answering this little something. Just scrolling for a minute. but attention has momentum to it. Every time we move it, something has to move with it. Our cognitive resources, our working memory, our emotional state, our nervous system. This is one reason repeated interruptions can leave us feeling strangely exhausted, even when we haven't done anything particularly physically demanding. We've been switching worlds all day long. And then we wonder why at 6 o'clock in the evening, we don't have the capacity for even the most important conversations, the ones that truly matter with our partners, with our family. But here is where I want us to go deeper. Because if we make smartphones the villain of this episode, we miss the much more interesting problem. We can switch our phones off and remain completely distracted. Some families actually utilize this tool. They have a basket when you enter the house. Everyone puts their smartphone in there, and they have a settled feeling inside that now everyone's participating, which is not true. Because we can switch that phone off, we can put that phone away and remain completely distracted because some of the loudest notifications come from inside of us. So let's look at the internal distractions: fear, rumination, regret, anticipation, self-consciousness, comparison, resentment, which is one of the biggest, unresolved conflict, the need to prove ourselves, the need to be liked, the need to know what is going to happen next, the need for control, another very big one. These things don't vibrate in our pockets, but goodness, they know how to get our attention. You can be sitting completely still in a silent room and have 27 tabs open internally. And this distinction matters enormously because external distraction competes for our attention. But internal obstruction consumes our attention. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're preparing for an important presentation. You know your material. You've prepared carefully. You're competent, you're ready. But underneath all of that, there is one persistent thought. What if they realize I don't belong in this room? Now imagine how much of your attention is available for the presentation. Part of you is delivering the material, another part of you is monitoring the audience. Did that person smile? Is that person skeptical? Was that question challenged? Am I talking too quickly? Do they believe me? Your body is in the presentation, but your attention has become divided between participation and protection. That's an internal obstruction. And from the outside, someone may simply conclude, okay, this person needs to work on their executive presence by observing your presentation. Maybe, but perhaps her executive presence isn't even missing. Perhaps it is occupied by an internal architecture that is consuming the capacity she would otherwise use to be present. That is a very different developmental conversation. And this is where the scientific lens becomes particularly helpful because stress changes the way we allocate attention. When the nervous system perceives a threat, resources naturally move toward protection. We become more vigilant, more wired. Our attention can narrow. We scan for danger. We become more sensitive to negative information. Working memory and cognitive flexibility can become harder to access under sustained stress. This isn't a design flaw. This is an extraordinary survival mechanism. If a tiger is running towards you, This is not a moment for expansive thinking. You don't need innovation. You need legs. But the nervous system doesn't only respond to tigers, it responds to social threats, which can be uncertainty, status, rejection, belonging, failure, loss of face, loss of significance. And modern leadership contains a lot of these. So imagine someone who appears disengaged at work. They're quieter. They're contributing less. They're no longer volunteering ideas. Their creativity has declined. They're avoiding difficult conversation. The manager thinks they're losing motivation. Perhaps. But what if they're under enormous stress? What if they no longer feel safe challenging their leader? What if they've experienced repeated rejection? What if they're afraid of failing? What if success itself has begun to feel dangerous? What if something in their life outside of work is consuming enormous psychological capacity? Suddenly, the question changes. Instead of asking, why aren't they engaged? We might ask, what is consuming the capacity they would otherwise use to engage? This is a very different question, you see, and I truly believe a much more human one. This brings us to something I think organizations desperately need to consider, or reconsider, I should say. We often speak about engagement as though it is something leaders must produce in other people. So how do I get the employees engaged? How do I engage my team? How do we improve engagement scores? How do we motivate people? But perhaps engagement isn't something we manufacture. Perhaps engagement is something that naturally emerges when enough interferences have been removed. Think about children. A child who feels safe and curious doesn't need a workshop on engagement. They engage with everything. A puddle can occupy them for 45 minutes. They ask questions, they experiment, they explore, they participate. Engagement is natural. We were born with it. What changes over time isn't necessarily our capacity for engagement. It's the amount of interference surrounding it. Fear, judgment, performance pressure, comparison, failure, expectations. Oh, what about disappointment? And gradually, participation becomes protection. Curiosity becomes certainty. Play becomes performance. Which makes me wonder, perhaps the leadership question isn't how do we make this person more engaged? Perhaps it is what has made engagement difficult here. And that takes us somewhere very interesting. Because once we stop treating disengagement as a character flaw, we can begin treating it as information. Behavior tells us that something is happening. Curiosity helps us discover what is happening. And in the next part of our conversation, I want to take you underneath the behavior into what I call the architecture of disengagement. We'll explore why two people who appear equally disengaged may be experiencing completely different internal realities. We'll revisit three internal frictions: the fear of failure, the fear of success, and the fear of loss of significance. And we'll explore how leaders can learn to detect what may be obstructing engagement without diagnosing, without assuming, and without rushing to fix it. Because perhaps one of the most important shifts we make as leaders and as a human being is to stop asking, what's wrong with this person? and become curious enough to ask, what might be getting in the way? If you're still with me, welcome back to part 2. In the first part of our conversation, we explored a different way of thinking about engagement. Not as enthusiasm, not as motivation, not even as commitment or productivity, but as the availability of our attention, energy, and agency for meaningful participation. And we made an important distinction. External distraction competes for our attention. Internal obstruction consumes our attention, which means that when engagement begins to disappear, something else may be already happening underneath it. And this is where I believe we've misunderstood disengagement, because disengagement is often treated as an explanation. We say, oh, this person is disengaged. That person has lost motivation. This team is not committed. But none of those statements actually explain anything. They describe what we can see, but they don't tell us anything about why it is happening. And this distinction matters tremendously because disengagement is a symptom. It is not a diagnosis. Imagine someone on your team who used to contribute regularly. They challenged ideas. They volunteered. They brought energy into meetings. They seemed invested. And gradually, something changes. They become quieter. They stop offering ideas. They do what is asked of them, but very little beyond that. They no longer challenge decisions. They stop raising their hand. Perhaps they even become slightly cynical. What does the leader see? Disengagement. And that's accurate. And what is the temptation? To intervene at the level of behavior. They say, I need you to participate more to the team member. I would like to see more initiative from you. You need to become more proactive. These are the types of feedbacks leaders provide seemingly disengaged individuals. Maybe we send them on a training program, a developmental program. Maybe we establish new goals. Maybe we create another employee engagement initiative. And sometimes those things do help, don't get me wrong. But before we do any of that, I think we should become curious about something else. What happened between the person who used to participate and the person sitting in front of us now? Because people rarely wake up one morning and decide, you know what? I think I'll stop caring today. Something usually happens, perhaps repeatedly. Maybe they offered ideas that were consistently dismissed. Maybe they challenged something and experienced humiliation. Maybe they worked extraordinarily hard and received no recognition, no positive feedback. Maybe responsibility increased while the autonomy decreased. They were asked to do more without given any kind of autonomy. Maybe the organization changed. Maybe the relationship with their manager changed. Maybe life outside of work changed, or perhaps nothing obvious happened externally at all. Perhaps the obstruction is internal. And this is where engagement becomes an architectural issue. One of the central ideas we've explored through the Valley is that behavior rarely begins where we can see it. There is an architecture underneath it. Beliefs, interpretations, past experiences, identities, fear, meaning, survival strategies, the nervous system. And that architecture influences how we perceive the world. It becomes our lens, which influences how we participate in the world. This means two people can display exactly the same behavior and require completely different forms of leadership intervention. Two employees stop volunteering for opportunities. One is afraid of failing, and the other is afraid of what will happen if they succeed. Same behavior, completely different obstructions. And there may even be a third person who isn't afraid of either, not success, not failure. They've simply stopped believing their contribution matters. Same behavior, three completely different realities. If we lead only what we can see, we will often solve the wrong problem. When we're treating symptoms, we may be missing the disease entirely. Over the years, I've noticed three forms of internal frictions repeatedly in high-performing people. I call them the three internal frictions: the fear of failure, the fear of success, and the fear of loss of significance. They are different, but all three can quietly reduce our willingness to participate, our engagement, whether it is at the organizational level or in our personal lives. Let's look at each of them through the lens of engagement. The first one is the friction of failure. Fear of failure is probably the easiest to recognize. We want something, an opportunity, a promotion, a relationship, a business, perhaps a creative project, a difficult conversation, but moving towards it feels scary because of the potential of failing. So something interesting happens here. We hesitate. We overprepare. We may even procrastinate. We perfect. So we stay in analysis paralysis. We wait for certainty, which never comes. We tell ourselves, I'm just not ready yet. Sometimes we even become extraordinarily productive on everything except the thing that matters most. We say it matters, but because we're afraid of failing at it, we push it aside and prioritize everything else, which is a very sophisticated form of avoidance. From the outside, it can look like disengagement, but internally, the person may care enormously. In fact, sometimes they care so much that participation feels dangerous. That is an important distinction. A lack of movement does not always indicate a lack of desire. Sometimes desire is enormous, but fear is standing in front of it. Imagine a flowing river. Now imagine a massive rock in its way. The water wants to move, but now its movement is limited. That's what we're talking about when we look at these frictions. Think about your life for a moment. Is there something you deeply want, but have quietly stopped moving toward it? Maybe it's a conversation. Maybe it's a career change. Maybe it is a relationship, someone you love and you have a crush on, but you just cannot conjure up the courage to approach them. Maybe it's a dream you deem impossible. Maybe it's a piece of work you would really like to take ownership of. Before concluding that you've lost motivation, ask yourself, have I disengaged because I don't care, or because I care enough that failure would hurt? Those are very different realities. The next friction is the friction of success. This is much less understood. There is a lot of confusion about the friction of success. At first, it sounds almost absurd. Why would anyone be afraid of getting what they actually want? But success changes things, you see. Success creates visibility. It creates expectations. It also creates responsibility. It creates exposure. Success asks us, can you sustain this? What will people expect from me now? And what happens when everyone discovers that I was not as capable at this as they thought? What will this require of me? These are some of the questions that run in the background of our minds. And sometimes, who will I become if this actually works? That's scary too. I've coached extraordinarily capable people who moved beautifully toward any opportunity until the opportunity became real. Then something changes. They hesitate, they create complications, and suddenly question whether they really want it. We call that a form of self-sabotage. They become distracted. They find reasons not to move. From the outside, it looks irrational. From the inside, the nervous system may simply be responding to increased exposure. Success has moved from possibility to reality, and reality carries consequences. This happens personally too. Someone says they want intimacy until intimacy arrives. They want a solid relationship until the solid relationship presents itself. Someone says they want freedom until freedom requires responsibility. Another person says they want their dream until the dream asks them to become someone they haven't yet learned to inhabit. Again, what looks like disengagement may be actually nothing but protection. Let's talk about the third friction. The third friction is probably the most subtle one. This is the fear of losing significance. Growth changes identity. When we grow, relationships can change. Roles change, power changes, belonging changes, expectations change. The way we relate to people and how they relate to us may change. And somewhere underneath all of that can live a very quiet question. If I become who I am capable of becoming, what might I lose? Perhaps belonging, perhaps familiarity, perhaps approval, perhaps an identity that has kept us safe for many years. This can appear in leadership in fascinating ways, whether it is moving from being a team member to becoming a team lead, or climbing the ladder from a smaller leadership role to a higher leadership role, or even imagine a leader who says they want their team to become more autonomous. They genuinely believe it. They encourage delegation, they talk about empowerment. But every time the team begins operating independently, the leader steps in. They step right back in. They correct. They take responsibility back. They become involved in details that no longer require their involvement. Why does the leader do this? Perhaps control isn't the real issue, because sometimes we call it micromanagement. But that's just surface level. We're just looking at the symptom. Perhaps significance is the real problem here. If the team no longer needs me in the same way, who am I? This is the question that lingers in the backdrop of this leader's mind. That's a very different question. And notice what happens to engagement. The leader becomes over-engaged in work they should release, while simultaneously becoming under-engaged in the leadership work their next level requires. That's fascinating, because engagement isn't always about doing more. Sometimes engagement requires letting go. Now, I want to be very careful that I don't make these purely an organizational conversation. The same frictions follow us home. These frictions travel with us. Fear of failure can keep us from pursuing the life we want. Fear of success can keep us from inhabiting the life we've created. Fear of losing significance can keep us attached to identities, relationships, and roles we've already outgrown a long time ago. And then we say, I feel stuck. Gosh, how many times have I heard that? Maybe you are stuck, but perhaps stuckness is simply what friction feels like from the inside. You still have energy, you still have desire, you still have capacity. But part of that capacity is being consumed by an internal negotiation. One part says move, the other part says don't move. Speak, stay quiet. Take the opportunity, stay safe. Grow, remain familiar. And this is why integration matters. And without it, dissonance sets in, which can be debilitating, whether in life or in leadership. And let's be clear, integration doesn't eliminate fear. It changes our relationship with it. It allows us to notice the part of ourselves that wants to move and the part of us that is afraid of what movement might mean. Instead of allowing one to unconsciously control the other, we become capable of holding both, which is important for our vulnerability. And then, voila, choice returns. That's in our authority, not the absence of fear, but the ability to remain in relationship with ourselves while choosing deliberately. Now, bring us back into an organization. A leader notices declining engagement. What happens usually? We measure output, we measure attendance, we measure participation, and we measure engagement scores. But imagine asking something different. How much human capacity is currently available because it is occupied by friction? Think about the organizational implications. The person afraid of failure may withhold ideas. A person afraid of success may avoid visibility. A person afraid of losing significance may resist delegation or even wanting to move to a new role. A person protecting against rejection may avoid feedback. A person who has learned that speaking up is dangerous may remain silent in meetings. A person overwhelmed by uncertainty may cling to familiar processes and avoid learning. What does the organization experience when this happens? Less innovation, slower decision-making processes, lower accountability, reduced collaboration, which is detrimental to organizational culture and creates silos. Less adaptability, more dependency, more politics, which is the number one cause of toxicity in organizational cultures, and eventually lower performance. We often try to correct these outcomes at the level of behavior. I see it over and over again. The nth number of developmental program teaching frameworks and techniques. But behavior may simply be the final expression of something happening much further upstream, which means perhaps engagement isn't fundamentally a performance problem. Perhaps performance is where consequences finally become visible. And this is where leadership becomes incredibly important. Because once we understand that behavior has architecture underneath it, there is a danger. We become amateur psychologists. She's afraid of success. Or we say, he's clearly struggling with significance. No, please don't do that. Just don't. The framework we use to understand human behavior should make us more curious, not more certain. A framework is a map. This is not the human being. So when you notice someone's engagement changing, don't diagnose. Inquire, ask questions, observe without judgment, become curious before concluding, ask before assuming, create the environment where others feel welcome to share and be vulnerable. Listen beneath the behavior instead of saying, "Why aren't you contributing anymore?" Try this. I've noticed you've been a little quieter in our meetings recently. How have you been experiencing this? Simple question, but we inquire instead of condemning someone, putting a label on them. Instead of, you need to take more ownership, we try, where do you feel you have genuine ownership right now? And where do you feel constrained? Instead of saying, you seem disengaged, Try saying, I've noticed a change in your energy recently. Is there anything making it harder for you to participate in a way that you would like? Do you feel the difference? The first set of questions already contains a verdict, a label. The second creates space for discovery. And perhaps the person says, actually, every time I offer an idea, it gets dismissed. Now you have information. Or the person says, I'm actually exhausted. Now you have information. Or they say, I don't understand where this organization is going anymore. Information. I'm afraid I'm going to fail in this new role, they say. Again, information. Or perhaps they say, I don't know. I hadn't noticed it myself. Wonderful. Now you can become curious together. That is leadership. Not having the answer, creating the condition in which truth can emerge in its entirety. Do you see how communication and listening come back here again? Because when we ask a question, but we're unable to listen, we're not going to be getting information. We just get confirmation of our standpoint. I just wanted to point that out here. There's one more dimension I want to add before we leave this part of our conversation. Remember our definition? Engagement is availability of our attention, energy, and agency for meaningful participation. Agency matters a lot. Human beings engage differently when they believe their actions matter. When people repeatedly experience that their voice changes nothing, their effort changes nothing, their ideas change nothing, their choices add no value, something begins to happen. They stop offering them. Not necessarily consciously. They simply learn. Why spend energy where energy produces no movement? Because everybody wants to move. Everybody wants movement, some sort of a movement. And this is where leaders must become very honest. Sometimes a disengagement we observe in others is partially an adaptation to the environment we have created. If I ask for your opinion and consistently ignore it, eventually you stop offering it. If I tell you I want you to take ownership, but override every decision, eventually you stop taking ownership. If I tell you mistakes are opportunities to learn, but punish you at the first visible failure, you learn something. Not from my words, but from my behavior. And this brings us directly back to coherence. People engage with the environment they experience, not the environment we claim to have created. Words matter, but what matters most is the energy behind the words, the consistency of that energy behind the words, the congruence we express. This is why engagement cannot be separated from leadership. So perhaps we need to change the question. Instead of asking, how do we increase engagement, we ask, what is obstructing meaningful participation? Instead of, how do I motivate this person, we ask, what might be consuming their available capacity? Instead of saying, why won't they take ownership, we ask, where has agency been reduced? And instead of immediately trying to fix what we find, we become curious. Because behavior tells us that something is happening. Curiosity, however, helps us discover what is happening. And once we discover that, something becomes possible. Choice becomes possible. Personally, we can begin reclaiming our attention from the things that have been consuming it. Relationally, we can become more present with the people in front of us. And organizationally, leaders can begin creating environments where human capacity is not constantly spent on protection. Which brings us to the final part of today's conversation. Because understanding engagement is valuable, but understanding without practice changes very little. So, in part 3 of our conversation, I want to bring this home to you. Not only as a leader, but as a human being. We'll explore 3 domains of engagement: your engagement with yourself, your engagement with others, and your engagement with life as you're creating it. I'll give you a simple engagement audit to help you identify where your attention is actually going, because that is valuable information. First, we want to know where the energy drain is happening. And then we'll turn towards leadership with an engagement inquiry, a practical way of exploring declining engagement without assumptions, without judgment and diagnosis. Because perhaps the question that matters most isn't, am I productive? Or even, am I engaged? Perhaps it is something far more intimate. Am I actually participating in the life I am living? Welcome back to part 3. We've traveled quite a distance together today. We've begun by asking a seemingly simple question. What does it mean to be engaged? And perhaps by now, the word means something slightly different to you. It sure does to me, because engagement isn't simply enthusiasm. It isn't motivation. And it certainly isn't an employee engagement score. Engagement is the availability of our attention, energy, and agency for meaningful participation. And throughout this conversation, we've discovered something important. Sometimes what looks like disengagement is actually exhaustion. Sometimes it may be disappointment. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's sheer fear. Sometimes it's loss of agency. And sometimes it's simply the consequence of having so much internal noise that very little of us remains available for the life happening in front of us. So before we talk about what leaders can do for other people, I would like to bring this conversation somewhere more personal. I would like to bring it to you. Not the executive, not the manager, not the entrepreneur, not the parent, not the partner. Just you. Because before engagement becomes an organizational issue, it is a relationship we have with our own lives. I want you to consider engagement across 3 dimensions. The first is engagement with yourself. How present are you to your own experience? Not how well you analyze yourself, not how much personal development you've done, not how many books you've read, but how available are you to yourself? Can you notice when you're tired before your body forces you to stop? Can you recognize resentment before it becomes anger? Can you feel desire without immediately explaining why it isn't practical? Can you notice fear without allowing fear to make the decision for you? Can you sit quietly long enough to hear what you actually are thinking before the word tells you what you should think? Self-engagement is not self-absorption. It is self-contact. And without contact with ourselves, inner authority becomes extraordinarily difficult. Because how can you lead from within if you are rarely there? The second dimension is engagement with others. Think about the people you love, your partner, your best friend, your children, your colleagues, your team. When you're with them, how much of you is actually there? This can be an uncomfortable question, I know, because physical presence is very easy to confuse with relational presence. We can sit across someone, nod, respond, even say all the appropriate things, while our attention is somewhere entirely different. Perhaps we're checking our phone. Perhaps we're replaying something that happened earlier. Perhaps we're already anticipating what needs to happen tomorrow. Perhaps we're listening, but as we explored in our previous episode, we're listening primarily to prepare for a response. And then there are those rare conversations where someone gives us their complete attention. You can feel the difference immediately. Time seems to slow down. You feel seen. Your thoughts become clearer. You say things you didn't know you were thinking. That's engagement. And perhaps one of the greatest gifts we can offer another human being in an age of distraction is an undivided presence. Not advice, not solutions, not another opinion. Presence. And then there is the third dimension. Engagement with your own life. This one is perhaps the biggest. Are you participating in the life you're creating, or you are perpetually preparing for it? There's a strange habit many of us develop. We postpone participation. When this project is finished, we say, when I have more money, when I feel more confident, when the kids are out of the house, when I lose this pesky couple of pounds, when I find the right life partner, when I get the promotion, when I retire, when things become less complicated, then I can travel. Then I can write, then I can rest. And I'll tell the people I love how I feel about them. I'll start a business. I'll enjoy what I've built. Then I can live. And somehow, life becomes a waiting room for life. And if you've ever witnessed it, you know how sad that can be. How when a person who has learned as a child to resist instant gratification, which is a very important tool as a child, has perpetuated it into a pattern of relating in their adult life that denies them all pleasure of this moment. Presence. That's perhaps one of the greatest tragedies of disengagement. Not that we stop performing. We may perform beautifully, but we stop inhibiting our performance. We never feel satisfied. We accomplish without truly experiencing. We achieve without fully arriving, always looking for the next event. We build without noticing what we built. And one day we look around and wonder, where did the time go? The answer is uncomfortable. It went exactly where our attention went. Which brings us to our exercise of today. I would like to give you a practice. You don't need a workbook. You don't need an assessment. You definitely don't need to score yourself. You simply need a little honesty. I call it the engagement audit. Find 10 quiet minutes sometime this week, preferably without your phone. Yes, 10 entire minutes without your phone. I believe in you. I know you can do it. Ask yourself, where in my life am I fully participating? Where do I feel alive? Where do I feel curious? Where am I present? Where am I available? Where does my energy naturally move toward in life? And then ask, Where am I physically present but psychologically absent? Perhaps it's in work. Perhaps it is in relationship. Perhaps it is in your health. Perhaps it is in the area of your self-development. Perhaps it's a dream you've been talking about for 5 years or a decade, but haven't touched at all. Don't judge the answer, and certainly don't judge yourself. Just notice it. Then ask, what is consuming my attention? Is it external? Is it notifications? Is it the workload? Is it constant availability for everyone else? Too many commitments? Or is it internal? Is it fear? Is it rumination? Is it comparison? Is it internal resentment? Is it the need for approval or need for certainty or need for control? Is it unresolved decisions? Is it guilt and shame about something you did wrong maybe 5 years ago? Then ask, which friction might be present? Am I protecting myself from failure? Am I protecting myself from success? Or am I protecting an identity, relationship, role, or a sense of significance that growth might be asking me to let go, to release? And then, where have I surrendered my agency? This is a very important question. Where have I convinced myself that I have no choice, when perhaps I have choices I simply don't like? That's different. And finally, I want you to sit with one question. Don't rush the answer. Let it follow you around for a few days. And here's the question. If my attention is with my life, what am I currently giving my life to? Because attention is not simply cognitive resource. Attention is an allocation of existence. Where your attention repeatedly goes, that is where your life force flows. And if you lead other people, I would like you to do a second exercise. Think of one person whose engagement seems to have changed. Just one. Perhaps they've become more quiet, less creative, less productive, or proactive. Maybe they're more cynical or dependent or withdrawn. Or perhaps they're still performing, but something about their energy has changed. Now, before you create a story about that and about why this is happening, stop. Remember, disengagement is a symptom. It is not a diagnosis. Start with what I call the engagement inquiry to collect information about what is happening and why. It starts with observation, not interpretation. For example, you say, I've noticed you've been quieter in our conversations recently. Or, I've noticed you haven't been bringing as many ideas into our meetings lately. Then get curious. How have you been experiencing things? Listen when they speak. Don't fix. Do not explain. Don't reassure them too quickly. Just listen. And if they're silent, allow the silence to be. That is them thinking. And you want them to become curious. Then perhaps ask, is anything making it harder for you to contribute in the way that you would like? Listen again. Then ask them, where do you currently feel greatest sense of ownership or purpose or enjoyment? And where do you feel constrained? You might ask, what part of your work gives you energy at the moment? Which part of your work gives you the greatest sense of satisfaction? And What seems to consume your energy or zap your energy, deplete your energy? And if trust allows the conversation to go deeper, you can ask this question. Is there anything you're currently holding back from because the risk feels greater than the possibility? Notice what you're doing. You're not asking, which friction do you have? Please don't do that. Don't do that. You're allowing the person to discover their own experience, because leadership isn't about becoming extraordinarily clever or explaining other people to themselves. It is about creating the condition in which people can see themselves more clearly. And sometimes the greatest thing a leader can do is ask the question that allows someone else to hear their own answer. Now consider what becomes possible when you lead this way. A person who feels safe enough to speak shares more information sooner. A person who believes their idea matters offers more of them. A person with genuine agency takes greater ownership. A person who isn't spending enormous psychological energy protecting themselves has more capacity available for creativity, for problem solving, for collaboration, for learning, for adaptation, for performance. Notice what happened. We didn't begin with performance. We began with the human being, and performance emerged from the conditions surrounding them. This is something I believe deeply. High performance is not simply something we extract from people. It is something that becomes possible when human capacity can be fully expressed. And this takes us back to the very first principle underneath my work. Leadership is an expression of human capacity, and integration determines that capacity. So perhaps engagement is the bridge between capacity and participation. It is where everything inside of us finally meets the world. For decades, organizations have asked, how do we get people engaged? I think the question needs to evolve, because embedded within the question is an assumption that engagement is something that organizations must somehow generate inside another human being. What if instead we asked, what conditions allow human beings to participate fully? Now we're talking about something very different. We're talking about trust, agency, meaning, psychological safety, belonging, challenge, autonomy, curiosity, growth mindset, coherence, and perhaps most importantly, now we're talking about leadership. Because leaders are constantly shaping those conditions through what they reward, what they punish, what they notice, what they ignore, what they ask, what they assume, how they listen, how they communicate, and how much of themselves they bring into a room, which is why these last three conversations belong together: communication, listening, and engagement. Communication creates the bridge. Listening allows us to cross it. And engagement determines whether we are available to participate in what becomes possible on the other side of this bridge. I want to return to Alan Watts, because beneath all the leadership language, the organizational psychology, the neuroscience, the frameworks, there is a much simpler human question. Are we here? Not, are we successful? Not, are we productive? Are we achieving our goals? Not even, are we happy? Just, are we here? Are we experiencing the life we're working on so hard to create? Are you present for the people you say matter to you? Are you participating in your own becoming? Are you allowing yourself to be affected by the world around you? Are you still curious? Are you still available to surprise? Are you still capable of noticing that your life is happening while you're busy making plans for it? Because perhaps the opposite of disengagement isn't productivity. Perhaps it is aliveness. And perhaps engagement at its deepest level is simply our willingness to meet life while life is happening. Not once everything is certain, not once everything is resolved, once our fears disappear. Now, here in this moment, with whatever this moment contains. So this week, I don't want to ask you to become more productive. I don't want you to optimize your attention. I don't even want you to become more engaged. I really don't. That's not what this conversation is about. I simply want you to notice, where am I in this moment? Where have I disappeared? What is consuming me? What am I protecting? This is such an important question. What am I postponing? And what becomes possible if I returned to this moment? Because your attention is precious, most precious commodity. Your energy is precious. Your capacity is precious. And your life is not happening somewhere in the future. It is happening in the conversation you're having, in listening to this podcast. The person sitting across from you, the work in front of you, the decision you've been avoiding, the dream that keeps returning, this moment, and then this one, and then the next one. And that's where life is. And perhaps that is where leadership begins too. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Through the Valley. If this conversation brought someone to your mind, a leader, a lover, a partner, a colleague, a friend, perhaps someone you adore, share this episode with them. Not because they need to become more engaged, but perhaps because all of us occasionally need reminding to come back to our lives. And now, I leave you with this. Shift your psychology to shift your energy and transform your leadership. Until next time.